Jacob Hale stood on a rooftop overlooking the Las Vegas Strip, a small velvet box shaking in his hand. 200 guests watched him lower himself onto one knee, his legs trembling from months of physical therapy he had never told anyone about. The woman in front of him was smiling, but it was not the woman anyone expected to see there. Just as he opened the box, a voice tore through the crowd.
Stop this wedding right now! She is only after his money, and I can prove it.
The music stopped. Jacob froze, ring still in hand, and somewhere in that silence, a year of his life came rushing back to him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 1 year earlier, Jacob Hale believed his life was exactly where it was supposed to be. He was 34 years old, the founder of a logistics company that had grown from a single delivery van into a fleet of trucks stretching across 4 states. He ran marathons on weekends, closed million-dollar deals on weekdays, and came home every night to Vanessa Cross, the woman he had been engaged to for 8 months. Vanessa worked as a regional sales director for a cosmetics brand, and together they were the kind of couple that other people pointed out at restaurants. Friends called them the golden couple. Jacob genuinely believed he had built a life that could not be shaken. He had no idea how wrong he was. What nobody around them could see was the quiet distance that had already started growing between Jacob and Vanessa. It was not loud or dramatic. It showed up in small things, like Vanessa checking her phone at dinner and turning the screen away when he reached for it, or the way she started coming home later from work without much explanation. Jacob noticed, but he told himself it was nothing, because that was easier than asking the question he was afraid to hear the answer to. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever ignored a small warning sign in your own life because the truth felt too heavy to face? Jacob did exactly that, and it would cost him more than he expected. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jacob was running the final stretch of a charity marathon he sponsored every year, pushing through mile 22 with his usual determination. Then his left leg simply stopped responding. He described it later as the ground disappearing beneath him, like his body had made a decision without asking him first. He collapsed in front of hundreds of runners and spectators, and the next clear memory he had was waking up under fluorescent hospital lights with an IV in his arm and his mother's voice somewhere close by, praying quietly. The days that followed were a blur of scans, blood draws, and doctors speaking to each other in low voices just outside his room. Jacob kept asking for straight answers and kept getting words like inconclusive and further testing required. After 9 days, a neurologist named Dr. Patricia Nunez sat at the edge of his bed and told him plainly that he had a rare autoimmune condition attacking the nerves in his lower spine. She said there was a real chance he would never walk unassisted again. Jacob remembered staring at the ceiling tiles and counting them, because counting felt safer than feeling anything at all in that moment. For the first few weeks after the diagnosis, Jacob refused almost every visitor. He canceled board meetings. He let calls go straight to voicemail. He sat in his dark apartment in a wheelchair he hated looking at, let alone using, and he waited for the one person he needed to walk through that door. Vanessa visited exactly twice in 3 weeks. On her second visit, she did not sit down. She stood by the window with her arms crossed, and after a long silence, she said the words that would replay in Jacob's mind for months afterward.
I did not sign up for this version of our life, Jacob. I am sorry, but I cannot do it.
He sat alone in the rain-colored light of that afternoon, and for the first time since the diagnosis, he actually cried. Have you ever loved someone and believed, without question, that they would stay no matter what happened to you? That belief is one of the most painful things to lose, because it does not just take the relationship, it takes your trust in your own judgment. Jacob spent the next several months rebuilding neither his legs nor his company, but simply his will to get out of bed. His mother, a retired schoolteacher named Carol, called him every single day, and every single day he let it ring until it stopped. 6 months after the diagnosis, Jacob's company had lost 2 major contracts because he refused to show up to meetings and his board of directors was quietly discussing whether he was still fit to lead. His father, a retired mechanic named Walter, finally drove 3 hours to Jacob's apartment, let himself in with a spare key, and sat down across from his son without saying a word for a long time. Eventually, Walter said something Jacob never forgot.
You can stay in this apartment and disappear, or you can come home for a while and remember who you were before all of this.
Jacob agreed to go home, mostly because he no longer had the energy to argue. The town Jacob grew up in was nothing like Las Vegas. It was a small place in Oregon called Fairhaven, with one main street, a diner that had not changed its menu in 20 years, and neighbors who still waved at cars they did not recognize. Jacob arrived using a wheelchair he had finally accepted he needed, feeling like a stranger in the life he used to know. He told himself he would stay a few weeks, get his bearings, and go back to Las Vegas once he figured out how to face his company again. He did not expect Fairhaven to change anything. He was wrong about that too. The very first afternoon back in town, Jacob's sister convinced him to come with her to the small regional airport to pick up a relative flying in for the weekend. The terminal was crowded, and as Jacob wheeled himself through the gate area, a woman rushing to catch a connecting flight tripped over the edge of his wheelchair and spilled an entire cup of coffee down his sleeve. Jacob, already exhausted and humiliated by needing help just to move through a building, snapped at her without thinking.
Can you watch where you are going?
You could have said, "Excuse me," instead of talking to me like that.
Then she walked off toward her gate without looking back, leaving him sitting there, oddly speechless. Jacob assumed that would be the last he ever saw of her. 2 days later, his family took him to dinner at a small restaurant on Fairhaven's main street to celebrate his homecoming, and their waitress that evening turned out to be the same woman from the airport. Grace recognized him instantly and raised an eyebrow. "Coffee sleeve guy," she said, loud enough for his whole table to hear. His mother laughed so hard she nearly choked on her water, and for the first time in almost a year, Jacob genuinely laughed too. Grace told him later she worked at the restaurant part-time while teaching dance classes at the community center, and that she had moved back to Fairhaven 2 years earlier to help care for her aging grandfather after her parents passed away in a car accident when she was in her 20s. The next morning, there was a knock at his parents' door. It was Grace, holding a container of homemade vegetable soup for Jacob's father, who was recovering from a minor surgery she had heard about from a mutual neighbor. She had not come to see Jacob at all, and that fact alone made an impression on him, because most people who visited him recently seemed far more interested in what had happened to his legs than in his family. Over the following weeks, Jacob found himself running into Grace constantly, at the walking trail behind the community center, at the small bookstore downtown, and at her weekend dance classes, where she eventually convinced him to sit in and watch even though he insisted he had no interest in dance. Grace never once asked Jacob about his diagnosis with pity in her voice. She asked practical questions instead, like what exercises his physical therapist had given him and whether he was actually doing them. When he admitted he had stopped his exercises months earlier out of frustration, she did not comfort him. She told him plainly that quitting would not bring his legs back, but consistency might. Nobody had spoken to him that honestly in a long time, and strangely, it was exactly what he needed to hear. If someone in your life stopped pushing you gently instead of just feeling sorry for you, would you notice the difference it made? Jacob noticed, and it changed something in him. Over the following 2 months, Jacob restarted his physical therapy with real discipline for the first time since his diagnosis. Grace often sat with him during his home exercises, sometimes reading a book nearby, sometimes just talking about nothing important while he worked through painful stretches. She told him once, sitting on his parents' back porch as the sun went down, "You still have everything that actually matters, Jacob. You just forgot for a while." He did not respond right away. He simply sat with the words, because they landed somewhere true. By the 4th month back in Fairhaven, Jacob had returned to running his company remotely, taking calls from his father's kitchen table, and slowly regaining enough strength to transfer from his wheelchair, using a single crutch for short distances. He and Grace had become close in a way that neither of them had planned or fully named yet. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon outside the local rehabilitation clinic where Jacob now did his sessions 3 times a week, Grace noticed a woman standing near a parked car, watching them from a distance. Jacob followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. It was Vanessa. Vanessa approached slowly, glancing at Grace's scrub-style work shirt with a look that was hard to mistake for anything but condescension. "A waitress, Jacob? Really?" she said, loud enough for Grace to hear clearly. Grace did not flinch. She looked at Vanessa calmly and said, "He does not need a model anymore. He needed someone who would not leave when things got hard." A small crowd of clinic patients and staff had gathered nearby, and Vanessa, visibly embarrassed, turned and walked back to her car without another word. Jacob later learned that Vanessa had heard through mutual friends that his company's contracts were recovering and that his prognosis had improved, and that timing was not a coincidence. 2 weeks after that encounter, Jacob's neurologist called with results from his latest scan. Dr. Nunez explained that his nerve inflammation had decreased significantly, more than she had expected at this stage, and that with continued intensive therapy, a full recovery of independent walking was possible, though not guaranteed. She was careful to remind him that this was not a miracle cure. It was the direct result of 8 months of consistent, painful, unglamorous work. Jacob later admitted to his father that hearing those words meant more to him than any business deal he had ever closed in his life. The months that followed were some of the hardest of Jacob's recovery. He fell more times than he could count during training sessions, sometimes crying out of pure frustration on the floor of the clinic. Grace was there for most of those sessions, never once telling him to stop, but also never letting him quit for the day when he wanted to. There is something worth asking yourself here. Would the people around you push you to keep going, or would they let you give up the moment things got difficult? Jacob was fortunate enough to have someone who chose the harder, more honest kind of support. By the 10th month after his diagnosis, Jacob could stand and take several steps using only forearm crutches, something his doctors had once called unlikely. He decided it was time to return to Las Vegas, not to leave Fairhaven behind, but to reclaim the parts of his old life that still mattered to him, and to ask Grace to come with him. She agreed, on the condition that she could still teach dance classes wherever they ended up, a condition Jacob happily accepted. 14 months after the marathon that changed his life, Jacob organized a private dinner on the same rooftop where he used to host business events, telling Grace it was simply a celebration of his recovery progress. As the sun set over the strip, he stood using his crutches, something he had been quietly practicing in secret for weeks specifically for this moment, and asked Grace to marry him. Guests who had gathered nearby, including his parents and closest friends, openly cried as she said yes. For a moment, it seemed like the story was finished, and that every hard chapter had led simply and cleanly to this one. That is exactly the moment Vanessa chose to walk back into his life. At their engagement celebration 2 weeks later, Vanessa arrived uninvited, accompanied by a lawyer and a folder of documents she claimed proved Grace had been secretly investigating Jacob's finances since the day they met at that airport. The room went quiet as she made her accusations loudly in front of everyone. Jacob, calmer than anyone expected, simply nodded to his head of security, who had already been briefed weeks earlier after noticing Vanessa researching Grace's background online. Security footage from the airport confirmed the coffee spill was an accident recorded by 3 separate cameras from different angles, and phone records showed Grace had never once contacted anyone about Jacob's company or his finances. The documents Vanessa presented were shown to be fabricated. She was escorted out of the venue in front of the same crowd she had hoped to humiliate Grace in front of, and she never contacted Jacob again. 1 year after that engagement party, Jacob walks without any assistance at all, something even his doctors describe as remarkable given where he started. Grace opened a small dance academy in Fairhaven, and Jacob quietly funds scholarships there for kids whose families cannot afford lessons, something he insists on keeping out of any press coverage. Together, they started a small foundation that provides wheelchairs and physical therapy support to people in Fairhaven and the surrounding counties who cannot otherwise afford it. Jacob's father, fully recovered from his surgery, still makes a point of thanking Grace every time he sees her for that container of soup she brought over on a random Tuesday morning years earlier. A few months ago, Jacob and Grace happened to be back at that same small regional airport, waiting for a flight to visit her extended family. As they stood near the same gate where they first met, Grace looked at Jacob, smiled, and deliberately tipped a small drop of coffee onto his sleeve. He looked down, then up at her, and started laughing before she even had the chance to explain the joke. Sometimes the worst day of your life quietly becomes the first day of the life you were actually meant to have. Jacob would tell you that himself. If you asked him, what do you think hurt Jacob more, losing the ability to walk, or discovering that the person he once trusted completely never truly loved him the way he believed? Let us know in the comments below. We genuinely read as many of them as we can. And if this story meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe to Empire Tale Studio, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the right people stay when life gets hard. If you enjoyed this one, do not miss our next story, coming soon.